Malcolm stood nervously on the cracked pavement outside a small shop in the French Quarter. The night air in New Orleans was incredibly thick. It felt like trying to breathe through a warm, wet flannel. Back home in Birmingham, a cold drizzle was probably beating against his dark office window. He had spent 10 years watching the grey clouds and feeling invisible. Here, the humid heat pressed heavily on his shoulders. He pushed his glasses up his sweaty nose with a trembling finger. He was utterly tired of being sensible and safe. He desperately wanted an adventure. He wanted a mysterious story to tell his colleagues. Above the peeling door, a wooden sign hung slightly crooked. It promised true fortunes, spirit readings, and glimpses into the future. Malcolm smiled a nervous, hopeful smile. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. A small brass bell chimed a dull, flat note into the humid night. He stepped carefully through a doorway covered by strings of wooden beads. They clattered together loudly, sounding like a bag of old bones tumbling onto the floor. Inside, the parlour was a cramped, suffocatingly hot room. The only light in the gloomy space came from 3 thick red candles. They flickered weakly on a small round table in the centre of the room. Thick grey dust floated lazily in the glowing air. It settled deeply onto crooked stacks of worn tarot cards. High above his head, an ancient ceiling fan struggled to spin. It made a slow, rhythmic clicking noise. Click, click, click. The sound chipped away at the quiet of the room. Malcolm took a shallow breath and immediately choked. The air smelled terrible. It was a heavy, eye-watering blend of sharp, burning sage and stale sweat. He almost turned around to walk back out into the street. Then, a voice croaked from the deep shadows. "Sit down, lonely boy." An old woman sat rigidly behind the small table. She looked ancient. Her skin was deeply wrinkled, resembling cracked leather. Her eyes were completely cloudy and blind. Malcolm swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his dry throat. He pushed his glasses up his nose yet again. He walked forward slowly and placed a crisp $20 note onto the table. He told himself that this was simply a bit of silly fun. There was no real magic in the world. He lowered himself onto a wobbly wooden chair opposite the strange woman. She did not even look at the money. Instead, she reached out a shaking hand and flipped a single tarot card over onto the table. The painted picture showed a tall stone tower being struck by a jagged bolt of lightning. Malcolm forced a polite laugh. He joked nervously that it looked like bad weather was coming. The woman did not smile or laugh. She leaned much closer to him over the table. The unpleasant smell of stale sweat grew terribly strong. "You came across the sea looking for love," she whispered. Her voice sounded like dry autumn leaves scraping roughly across a stone path. "You crossed the deep ocean to find a warm, beating heart, but you will only find cold, dead earth in this city." Malcolm shifted very uncomfortably in his wobbly seat. The reading was suddenly far too close to the truth. His heart began to beat a little faster. He decided he had heard enough nonsense for one evening. He tried to pull his hands away from the table to leave. Instantly, the old woman struck like a snake. Her bony fingers clamped tightly around his right wrist. The grip was incredibly strong and rough. Her long, dirty fingernails dug deeply into his skin like sharp animal claws. Malcolm gasped loudly in shock and tried to pull his arm back. She held him firmly in place. "Look at me!" she hissed angrily. With her free hand, she reached up and pulled down the collar of her faded blouse. She revealed her bare, withered shoulder to the flickering candlelight. A strange mark was inked deeply into her wrinkled skin. It was a dark, badly faded tattoo of a blooming flower. "Beware the woman in red," the psychic begged loudly. Her cloudy eyes were suddenly wide open and filled with absolute terror. When the loud music plays on the street, do not look at her face. If you see the flower on her shoulder, you must run away and never look back. Malcolm almost ran out of the stuffy parlour and stumbled onto the uneven pavement. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him. He rubbed his sore wrist where the old woman had gripped him so tightly. He took a deep gulp of the night air to clear the harsh smell of burning sage from his lungs. The air out here was not much better. It was a confusing mix of thick, sweet magnolia flowers and the sharp stink of spilled beer. Beneath it all lay the damp, muddy scent of the nearby river. Malcolm pushed his glasses firmly up his sweaty nose. He felt incredibly foolish. He was a grown man from Birmingham, yet a tired old woman in a dusty room had absolutely terrified him. He decided he needed a stiff drink and some loud music to forget the nasty experience. He walked quickly down the dark pavement towards a glowing intersection. This was the midnight street corner where the bright tourist area met the darker, older alleys of the city. Malcolm stopped at the edge of the pavement and stared at the lively chaos. Bright neon bar signs flashed in bold pink and electric blue colours against the buildings. The bright lights illuminated peeling, rotten wooden balconies that hung dangerously low over the street. A massive crowd of people stood in a tight circle in the middle of the road. In the centre of the circle, a brass band played a wild, energetic jazz tune. The sound was absolutely overwhelming. The deafening, hypnotic boom of the trumpets echoed loudly off the tall brick walls. The deep thumping of a heavy bass drum rattled right inside Malcolm's chest. He smiled for the first time that evening. This was exactly the kind of vibrant adventure he had crossed the ocean to find. He edged closer to the dense crowd of clapping onlookers. He wanted to feel like he was part of the fun. He desperately wanted to blend in and stop feeling so terribly alone. As he squeezed between two tall tourists, the crowd parted slightly. That was when he finally saw her. A beautiful young woman was dancing alone in the very centre of the circle. She wore a stunning bright red dress that seemed to catch every flash of the neon lights above. She moved with absolute fluid grace. Her bare feet glided smoothly over the dirty cobblestones as if she were floating on a calm lake. She twisted and turned in perfect time with the wild rhythm of the blaring trumpets. Malcolm stood completely still and stared at her. He forgot about his sore wrist. He forgot about the terrifying tarot reading. He even forgot to push his glasses back up his nose. All his lonely years spent in a grey, rainy city suddenly felt a million miles away. He could only focus on the vibrant dancer in the red dress. The old psychic had clearly warned him about a woman wearing red. The terrifying words still echoed faintly in the back of his mind. But Malcolm was too captivated to listen to his own common sense. He was entirely blinded by his desperate hope for romance. He reasoned with himself that red was simply a very popular colour for a party. Surely half the women in New Orleans were wearing red dresses tonight. He told himself it was just a silly coincidence. He took another eager step forward into the front row of the cheering crowd. As the brass band reached a loud, frantic climax, the dancer spun around and faced him directly. She had dark, beautiful eyes that locked instantly onto his face. Out of the 100 people standing in the circle, she was looking specifically at him. A slow, knowing smile spread across her red lips. She reached out a slender arm and pointed a delicate finger right at his chest. Malcolm felt a sudden jolt of electricity shoot down his spine. The heavy, muddy scent of the river seemed to fade away completely. The deafening boom of the trumpets faded into a dull hum in his ears. He was finally being noticed. He was finally desired. He stepped confidently forward onto the cobblestones to meet her, completely ignoring the terrible danger waiting in the shadows. Malcolm stepped nervously forward onto the rough cobblestones. The cheering crowd closed in tightly behind him. He was now standing right in the middle of the bright circle. The deafening music from the brass band seemed to vibrate right through his bones. He pushed his glasses up his sweaty nose. He felt incredibly clumsy and out of place. But the beautiful dancer in the bright red dress kept her dark eyes fixed on him. She glided smoothly across the street towards him. Her movements were entirely silent and perfectly graceful. She stopped right in front of him. A slow, gentle smile touched her red lips. She extended her delicate hand towards him. Malcolm felt his heart flutter wildly in his chest. He reached out and placed his warm palm against hers. He instantly let out a sharp gasp of shock. The unnatural chill of Maria's hand against his warm palm was horrifying. Her skin was as cold as solid ice. It felt exactly like touching a frozen piece of meat left in a cold butcher shop. A deep, heavy shiver ran quickly down Malcolm's spine. Every sensible instinct in his brain screamed at him to pull his hand away. He wanted to turn around and run back to his safe hotel room, but he looked at her beautiful face. He told himself a silly lie. He convinced himself that she had simply been holding a cold drink. Or perhaps the damp night air from the nearby river had chilled her skin. His desperate loneliness completely silenced his common sense. He swallowed his fear and wrapped his fingers tightly around her freezing hand. Maria pulled him smoothly into the dance. She was incredibly strong for such a slender woman. She guided his awkward feet easily across the uneven street. Malcolm felt terribly stiff at first, but the hypnotic rhythm of the blaring trumpets soon washed over him. The heavy smell of sweet magnolia flowers seemed to surround them like a thick cloud. He actually laughed out loud. He felt a sudden, foolish rush of pure joy. Nobody in Birmingham would ever believe this story. He was dancing with the most beautiful woman in New Orleans. He was the absolute center of attention. The brass band suddenly played a wild, rapid tune. The tempo of the music doubled in speed. Maria squeezed his hand tightly. She stepped back and began a fast, elegant spin. The bright red fabric of her dress flared out beautifully around her legs, like a blooming rose. As she spun rapidly, the thin left strap of her dress slipped off her shoulder. It dropped down her pale, cold arm. Malcolm stopped smiling immediately. He stared hard at her bare shoulder. Just beneath her collarbone, a dark shape was inked deeply into her pale skin. It was a dark, badly faded tattoo of a blooming flower. It was the exact same mark he had seen only an hour ago. It was the terrifying mark from the withered shoulder of the old, blind psychic. The psychic's desperate warning screamed loudly inside Malcolm's head. She had begged him to run away if he saw the woman in red. She had warned him about the blooming flower. The absolute terror in the old woman's cloudy eyes suddenly made perfect sense. This beautiful dancer was a dangerous trap. Maria finished her spin and stepped close to him again. Her dark eyes were completely empty and vacant. She tilted her head slightly and smiled that same slow, knowing smile. The freezing cold from her icy fingers began to make Malcolm's hand turn numb. The terrible smell of wet earth and rotting meat faintly replaced the sweet scent of the magnolia flowers. This was his final chance to escape. He knew he should push her away and run into the crowd. But Malcolm was a desperately lonely man. He looked at the beautiful woman holding him. He felt thrilled that she had picked him out of everyone else. He decided that the tattoo was just another coincidence. He pushed his glasses up his nose with his free hand. He pulled her freezing body closer to his own. He willfully chose to ignore the warning, firmly closing his eyes to the terrible danger. The lively dance continued to swirl rapidly around them. Malcolm smiled foolishly as he held Maria close to his chest. Her delicate body was terribly cold, but he convinced himself it was simply thrilling. He was finally living a real adventure. Suddenly, Maria gripped his hand much tighter. Her icy fingers felt like a metal vice clamping down on his bones. She stopped dancing abruptly and pulled him firmly towards the dark edge of the street. Malcolm stumbled slightly over the uneven cobblestones. He pushed his glasses up his nose, feeling a sudden rush of nervous excitement. He assumed she wanted some quiet privacy away from the noisy, drunken crowd. He eagerly followed her into a narrow, dark gap between two tall brick buildings. They stepped out of the flashing neon lights and into a dark, empty alleyway. The atmosphere changed instantly. The warm, humid air of the busy street vanished. A deep, unnatural chill crept slowly through the narrow space. The tall brick walls on either side were slick with black, smelly moisture. The smell in the alley was absolutely awful. The sweet scent of magnolia flowers was completely gone. Instead, the sharp, sour stench of wet earth and rotting meat heavily filled Malcolm's nose. He coughed softly and tried to take a step back towards the bright street, but Maria pulled him much deeper into the suffocating shadows. She pressed him roughly back against the damp, slimy brick wall. Her beautiful face was very close to his own. Malcolm felt a strong surge of foolish romance, entirely expecting a passionate kiss. He closed his eyes slowly and leaned forward. Instead of kissing him, Maria grabbed his cotton shirt with both of her freezing hands. She began to shake uncontrollably. He opened his eyes in complete surprise. The smooth, vacant expression on her face was completely gone. She looked utterly terrified and desperately trapped. Her pale lips trembled violently as she struggled to speak. She was clearly fighting against something entirely invisible. Finally, she forced out a desperate, rattling whisper. It sounded like stale air escaping from an old stone tomb. She begged him to run away before it was too late. "Please, you must run. The music is a shroud, and the dance is a grave." Malcolm frowned in deep confusion. He could hardly hear her small voice over the deafening boom of the brass band playing behind them. He politely asked her to repeat herself. He wanted to know exactly what was wrong. Maria just stared at him with wide, pleading eyes. A single tear rolled slowly down her frozen cheek, but the liquid looked black in the heavy shadows. She weakly pushed his chest, silently urging him to leave the alley. Malcolm felt incredibly frustrated. He had finally found a genuine romantic connection, and now she was acting like a completely frightened animal. He turned his head back towards the bright street, intending to ask a friendly tourist for some help. As he looked back at the lively intersection, an impossible thing happened. The sudden, terrifying silence dropped over the entire street like a heavy lead blanket. The loud jazz music did not fade away slowly. It simply stopped completely in a single split second. The deep, rattling thumping of the bass drum vanished. The wild, blaring trumpets fell absolutely mute. The joyful cheering and clapping of the large crowd ended instantly. The absolute quiet was truly deafening. It made Malcolm's ears ring loudly in his head. He squinted through the deep gloom, repeatedly pushing his glasses up his sweaty nose with a shaking hand. The entire street party had frozen perfectly in place. The energetic musicians had slowly lowered their bright brass instruments to their sides. The dancing tourists stood rigidly still on the dirty cobblestones. Nobody was moving a single muscle or making a single sound. Then, as if controlled by one single evil mind, every person in the crowd slowly turned their heads to face the dark alleyway. Hundreds of people stared directly at Malcolm. Their faces were totally blank and completely expressionless. Their eyes were dead, empty, and glassy. They looked exactly like discarded, broken dolls left inside a dusty attic. The terrifying truth finally crashed down onto Malcolm. This was not a lively street party. It was a carefully planned trap, and he was the only living guest. Malcolm stared at the sea of dead eyes. His desperate dream of a romantic holiday shattered completely in his mind. He finally understood the terrible mistake he had made. The sweet illusion was entirely gone, replaced by pure, freezing terror. He quickly let go of Maria. She immediately slumped against the damp brick wall like a broken, forgotten puppet. Her brief moment of human struggle had vanished. Malcolm spun around and sprinted blindly deeper into the dark alleyway. He desperately needed to get far away from the silent, staring crowd. He stumbled wildly over the slick cobblestones, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. The sharp, sour stench of rotting meat grew much stronger with every terrified step he took. It choked him, making his eyes water violently in the gloom. The narrow alley suddenly opened up into a wide, enclosed stone courtyard. Malcolm skidded to a clumsy halt. He looked frantically around for another exit. There were no wooden doors and no other busy streets. Extremely tall brick walls surrounded him completely. They completely blocked out the colourful neon lights from the tourist areas, casting everything in deep, sharp shadows. The suffocating smell of wet earth was utterly overpowering here. It felt exactly like standing inside an open, freshly dug grave. Malcolm pushed his thick glasses up his sweaty nose with a shaking hand. He spun around rapidly to run back the way he had just come. His only escape route was already gone. The dark entrance to the narrow alley was entirely blocked. The dead crowd from the street party was slowly shuffling into the enclosed courtyard. Hundreds of vacant, lifeless people moved together in absolute silence. Their flat shoes scraped softly against the stone, but nobody spoke a single word. They formed a thick, solid wall of rotting human bodies. Maria walked slowly at the very front of the terrifying group. Her bright red dress looked like a fresh, wet stain in the heavy gloom. Malcolm took several trembling steps backwards. His shaking shoulders finally hit the cold, hard brick wall at the very far end of the yard. He was completely trapped. Then, a new sound broke the unnatural, heavy quiet. It was a slow, metallic clicking noise. Click, clack, click, clack. The sharp sound echoed loudly around the enclosed stone courtyard. A tall figure stepped smoothly out from the deepest black shadows near the side wall. It was a tall man dressed in an elegant, immaculate white suit. He walked slowly towards Malcolm with supreme, terrifying confidence. In his right hand, he held a heavy, black wooden walking stick. A shiny silver skull decorated the top of the polished stick. The man tapped the silver tip deliberately against the rough cobblestones. Click, clack. He kept perfect time with a slow, invisible song that only he could hear. The tall man stopped a few feet away. He tipped his neat white hat back slightly. He had a cruel, handsome face and a supremely arrogant smile. He looked at Malcolm exactly as a curious scientist might observe a pathetic, trapped insect. "Welcome to my quiet home, lonely traveller," the priest said smoothly. His voice was incredibly rich and deep, vibrating gently like a heavy church bell. I have been waiting for you. Malcolm pressed his trembling back much harder against the damp brick wall. He opened his mouth to scream loudly for help, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. He could only stare at the terrible, smiling man. You crossed an entire ocean because you felt invisible, the priest continued. He slowly reached out and stroked Maria's cold cheek. She did not blink or move away. You wanted so desperately to be chosen. You ignored every clear warning just to feel a cold hand in yours. Your foolish loneliness made my work incredibly easy. The priest laughed softly. The echoing sound was horribly cold and lacked any real human joy. He raised his silver walking stick and pointed it directly at Malcolm's chest. "Do not look so terribly sad," the priest whispered, with a wicked, shining smile. "You will never have to feel alone again in my eternal gallery. You will dance for me forever." The silent, dead crowd stepped forward as one single entity. Countless cold, heavy hands reached out from the darkness to claim him. Malcolm closed his eyes tightly, wishing desperately he had never left the grey, rainy streets of Birmingham. The clock has struck, the candles have burned low, and the shadows are retreating, for now. I hope you enjoyed this week's descent into the unknown. There is a strange comfort in the dark, isn't there? Knowing that while we may be haunted, we are rarely ever alone. Thank you for spending this time with me. We'll return to this space, same time next week with another fragment of the forgotten. Until then, keep your porch lights on and your eyes wide. I've been your host, Silas J. Pendle. Good night, and sleep well.